Welcome to the Equity Institute's podcast on the purpose of public education with me, Vincent Perez. Today, we're going to have Dr. Randy Nunez sharing his perspective on his experience in public education and his service. I first met Randy at a LEAP conference. The LEAP is the Latina Education Achievement Project, and it was a conference and legislative day where he brought students, and I saw him every year, year after year, supporting the students in their civic engagement. Randy's a public servant, someone very interested in the healing ways, especially for men of color. I'm so grateful to know Randy and to experience spaces with him where we are deeply committed to our own healing. Please welcome Randy Nunez. I'm so grateful. Thank you for being here, Randy. If you could start with our listeners, just tell us a little bit about who you are and your connection to public education.
Sure. Thank you. Randy Nunez. I am the son of Ambrosio and Petra, by way of South Texas and Sinaloa. And they both came up to Washington State as farm workers. And for me, that's kind of where my story begins in the Yakima Valley. I was born in a really tiny agricultural town in East Oregon. But I grew up in Washington State and the Yakima Valley, right in Yakima specifically. As a Mexican kid growing up in Yakima in the late 80s, early 90s, it definitely was an experience of the conditions of Yakima. It was then and probably largely now predominantly brown working class. And I wouldn't say there was a very large affluent community, but yeah, at least the middle class was predominantly white. And so there was a very clear racial and economic divide. I grew up in public housing over in Yakima and, went to the local public schools, kind of walked to school for the most part. And I think my primary education was mostly positive. I did have experiences where it was very clear microaggressions and profiling. And, even examples of, as a kid then, and this may have been in the early 90s, late 80s, and being picked out with a group of friends and being disciplined. Even then as a kid, being really confused, but the discipline then was to paddle us. Oh, wow. And it's interesting, when my mom speaks of her educational experience where paddling was a very common occurrence. So when I think of it, that's something that happened in the distant past, but it was it's something that happened to me as a second grader right in Yakima. And in fact, it was done when there was no parental permission or, my mom was working at the warehouse and they tried calling her. They weren't able to reach her because, of course, she's working in a warehouse. And so they had paddled me and my friends. And so what that ended up looking like as a kid is getting into trouble all the time on a regular basis. Everything from what they would call as being disrespectful to teachers to more minor things, but being sent to the office on a very regular basis in the middle school level until I was eventually expelled out of middle school. Things would just escalate. And by then, as a kid, being really turned off enough to where I just didn't care if they expelled me. I felt like, well, okay, you're doing me a favor. I don't want to be here as it is anyways. It took me years to kind of get back. And so I say all of that is that I had such a negative experience in public education and decided to work in public education kind of in spite of it, because I felt like my saving grace had to do more with what was outside of school. Mm-hmm. And so I want to work in education because what got me into the work was social justice work. My area of social justice as being in public education. And I think in social justice work, there's a number of spheres to go into, whether it's labor or environment. And for me, it was public education. And so that's what got me to where I am, was thinking about my experiences and where I want to make my changes.
And so where are you now?
I'm with the Bellevue School District. I work as, my title is a equity specialist. And so my work involves professional development with other educators.
So then you frame that whole childhood experience of ed, and now as a professional, your vocation also in education. The whole purpose of this podcast is really thinking about what is the purpose of public education.
Knowing what my background was to even be there. So to be a student at the University of Washington, and what I considered a palace, this farm worker Mexican kid who's now at the University of Washington campus. I was just blown away. What I wanted to do then, I didn't know. And I thought, because my mentality then, because I was largely a street kid when I was in Yakima, was just put myself in a position and just hustle, figure something out. I had no idea what to do. I just knew that being at the University of Washington campus was better than where I was growing up in terms of options that I was going to have. And so, I ended up studying political science and history. And when I graduated, really thinking like, what is it that I want to do? I just want to be involved in the community. And I started working for nonprofits. And I wanted to work with youth, but I didn't want to work in public education because I saw it as very bureaucratic. And of course, because of my own experiences. I thought there would be no way that they would not only accept who I was, but embrace what I'm trying to propose. And so I worked with nonprofits who worked with schools for years. And a program that I was running was going to sunset. And some of the district leadership, they had reached out to me and said, hey, we'd love for you to be able to work for our district. And I was like, no, I was reluctant because of my own experiences. I thought I'd give it a try. I realized that in public education, it was just the hub of a community. And all of my critiques I think are still valid. It's still very bureaucratic and it's a challenge. But in terms of where to make an impact in public schools, I thought, wow, this is a place, if I could organize within this organization, then we can move some things. I say all of that because when I think about what is the role of public education, I was interested in working with youth because I felt the piece that was missing was their well-being, them being able to have their identity not only seen, but places for them to explore and to flourish. As a kid, and what I was experiencing, even as in my middle school, was I felt my identity was having to be compromised at this for the sake of success in the classroom. And I felt like there was always having to negotiate that. And on the adult side, I realized that doesn't have to be the case for our young people. It should be places for them to really thrive in who they are and their identity. And the academic piece, we have that down to a science. But it's kids feeling disconnected. And so when we do survey after survey and what kids need, and when they talk about a sense of belonging, when they say we need more people to look like us in schools, ultimately they're screaming for connection. And so I think that's what's needed in schools. I think the purpose of education is the well-being of our young people. We're helping to not shape is too strong of a word, but to have relations with people who are going to be our neighbors, people who are going to have relationships with. And so I really think about that. And I say that because I've been in education long enough where, I have who were once students of mine who are now colleagues of mine. And so literally, these are our neighbors. I'm glad when I see them that they had a very positive experience with me. And when I think about my educational experience in throughout K-12, there just wasn't any connection. There wasn't a person a staff member that I can highlight to say that, this person made a big difference in my education. And so I think the well-being, the connections are key in education. And I think for students who've been historically marginalized by our systems, that's what screams out.
So really, in that I hear our humanity, our whole personship. Are there any particular approaches, philosophies, models, frameworks that you believe align particularly well with this understanding that education's purpose is to connect with students? There's something you said about being a neighbor that's, I think, very accessible, right? That makes a lot of sense to me. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, they're going to be my neighbors. And so is there anything that's really working that you're saying that's actually doing that and meeting those needs?
Yeah. So at least from my role as an educator, and again, I'm in the role of designing professional development and community engagement. And on the community engagement side, in my academic experience in grad school, we try to work on a practice called co-designing. And all that means is collaborating with communities when we're making decisions, but doing it in a very relational way. It's not a transactional way. And I think that's what comes up a lot in the field of education, is that it's very transactional. For example, we have parent night. The reason why we want to have parent night is so that you can come over here and learn about our system. That's a very transactional relationship. And so co-design is to be able to nurture a very authentic relationship so that we're seeing each other's humanity. And as educators, it's not the title, or it's not willing to show some vulnerability or recognize our own flaws. And so once we get to that relationship piece, then we can truly talk about what are the needs for our kids. And it may be something that is entirely different. If it's a matter of the well-being of our kids, and our kids are saying, if our parents are telling us, well, the reason why so-and-so is showing up late or hasn't been there for a few days is because they have they have this horrible toothache. And as an educator, we can take that as, okay, that's not something that's not our thing. It's like, well, but if that is impacting their education, then it is our thing. And so we have to really account for, not to necessarily provide answers for, but to recognize that what we know of learners is that learners learn best when they feel like they belong, when their needs are met. And that's when they're going to have the best learning environment. And so I think when we're able to think about a co-design model, and it's also called like solidarity co-design, but it's ultimately to be able to work with families and communities in a very relational way, so then we can get at some of the root of the things that we're trying to address. And also then we have more people on board. We're able to learn from families and communities, and the learning from families and communities, and there's another practice that I think is incredibly valuable, and that's what people will call like using an asset lens or a funds of knowledge, like recognizing the values and the wealth of knowledge that families are already bringing into our schools that we as educators have to tap into. So we had a district leadership institute 2 weeks ago that involved all of our district leaders. We had this training about 2 weeks ago, and we actually held it at the CMAR Chicano Latino Museum. So completely different space than what we would traditionally have. And the institute is 3 days. 1 day was offsite, and I was a part of the planning side, and we wanted to have a completely different environment to engage learning, because the topic was elevating student voice. And so it included a museum exploration, and another piece included a Danza Azteca group, so an Aztec dance group. And the Aztec dance group wasn't just there to perform, but they were actually to share some of their teachings and learnings, and what their danza means to who they are. The family was there as a danza group, and there was actually a real small kid that was a part of this group who we found was an incoming kindergartner, because we knew that when she recognized her soon-to-be principal, when she ran up to him and hugged him. And it was obviously like a very beautiful moment, like, wow, who would have known? And she was really excited. And during our lunchtime, they actually gave us a ceremony, a performance. And the little girl was up there, and, as 4 or 5-year-old, of course, was shy to be on stage, and she was just walking around, maybe for the first couple of sets. But by the end of their ceremony, she was just as engaged as the other danza members. And so as educators, we're seeing her completely open up. And our superintendent, made it a point when we closed to say, look, we have this incoming kid who's coming in with this wealth of experience and knowledge. And if we're not doing our job, we're going to miss this. Like, we have to recognize that all of our kids are coming with incredible ancestral knowledge. And so I think in terms of like other models is to think about, how do we as educators think about this funds of knowledge, this asset lens, and we're going to be able to provide learning communities the more that we learn from their families and who they are.
That makes me, I lean a lot into Tala J. Yoso's community cultural wealth and the cultural capital. So tapping into aspirational capital of families, ancestral, familial, linguistic, and I found, like funds of knowledge, the asset-based frameworks are not utilized very often, right? We're always in this just deficit mindset. Oh, they still have to learn English, or as opposed to the asset framework and say, whoa, they're going to be a bilingual student, and they're going to have two languages. And what we know, a bilingual brain is a really strong brain, right? So I'm curious, in as you see systems begin to tap into funds of knowledge, begin to co-design with families and students, how do you overcome the challenges of the bureaucratic nature of kind of what public ed has been? I'm curious how identifying those challenges and then figuring out the solutions to do the good work.
Yeah, and I think a bureaucratic aspect in education that is just incredibly seeped in are traditional measurements. Because, ultimately, whatever work we're invested in, then we want to see the data. We want to see what difference does it make. And legitimately, in terms of, if we're investing in a resource, we want to know what difference it's made. And I think there's some legitimacy too. Though I think in terms of what we're measuring and how we're measuring, I think that's where we can, it's what we can interrogate a little bit more. And it reminds me of a quote that a colleague was sharing of mine, and I wish I could credit who exactly said it. But if we don't measure what we value, we end up valuing what we measure. And the valuing what we measure is, I think, as educators, is what we get stuck in. But imagine if we were actually measuring what we value. What are the things that we value? And then how do we find ways to measure that? And, granted, some of it may be, the surveying, a sense of belonging, but I think there's other ways to be able to capture what is it that we're trying to achieve, and capture it in also in very narrative ways.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. But I think in terms of trying to overcome some of the bureaucracy of large organizations and organizations that are having to make decisions, and there's often budgetary constraints and time constraints in these decisions, and so I recognize that as organizations are moving and having to make decisions, but ultimately, how do we, at least on the data collection side, do a better job in capturing the things that we really value and what we want our kids to leave with. I work in a school district that is often praised because of its academic achievements and where our kids go to college, and that's fantastic. And at the same time, we have kids who feel as disconnected as kids anywhere else. And so there isn't necessarily a relationship. If a student is doing academically well, then everything else must be well. That's not necessarily the case. And I worked on the college side, and I've seen the kids who show up to college that first year and they experience burnout or even go through depression because the things that they had experienced, they suppressed for so long that they begin to bubble up their first year of college. And people are shocked that these kids end up dropping out when they were academic achievers. And it's well, there were other needs that we just didn't address very well. And so I think how we model is important. But ultimately, getting back to the bureaucracy piece is we can do a better job in measuring what we value.
So that to me, my next question would be about so if there's a call to action to systems, to professionals, it sounds like this is it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's absolutely top. I think I was in, speaking of this Leadership Institute, we had one of our presenters who is the author of Street Data. Her name is Shane Safir. And she gave a little piece on the history of grades. And I was curious, and I still want to go back and investigate a little bit more. But she kind of talked about, where does grades come from? This, A through F, this 4-point system. And she cited, it may have been Harvard when it was first introduced, but to be able to categorize people in terms of their academic ability. And ultimately, it's just one of those things that it wasn't necessarily interrogated, but it just provided a way to for people to practice. But it does make me think of these traditional measurements as, some of them are outdated or not useful or cause unnecessary stressors. And us in the professional world, in my professional experience after my undergrad for the last almost 25 years, have never been once asked, have asked about my transcripts or my grades, but, my performance and abilities are based on far other factors. And so there's not, it's just really, there's a miss in how we're assessing kids and how they're doing and how we're making decisions for them to move through our systems.
That piece about grades, I think maybe since high school or even certainly in college for sure, where I'm what is this symbol, this letter? I got a B. This is not a representation of my learning, right? Or I got an A and I didn't learn anything. I just it was really easy to do, or I got a C, but I was curious and I investigated and I was really wrestling with these concepts or these skill sets. So that makes me, I'm really curious now about how to innovate from that.
Yeah. And what are the perceptions that kids have about them? As a kid, I thought that made the difference whether you're going to college or not, or if you're moving on. And I tell kids now, academically, I've always been an average academic kid. I've never been a top academic performer in a classroom, but yet I completed a doctorate degree 3 years ago. And I've always thought that, only the highest achievers have those opportunities to move up. And in academia, you realize that, people are looking for other aspects and what you bring to the table. And it took me a long time to realize my own life experiences bring a tremendous amount to the table that I know educators traditionally, don't have. And I know what I bring is a tremendous value to provide insight into the kids that we're trying to connect. But yeah, that academic piece, like I've always had this wrong impression. And I'm glad that I had community leaders really push against that and say, you know what, you still need to apply to grad school. You still need to move on. Because otherwise I thought I had no chance.
My final question, as I designed this is, how did schooling impact you? You've spoken about that a little bit. But when I hear your story, even as you opened up to PhD, I mean, from that beginning, you wouldn't assume that that's the ending. Yeah. So, I mean, what was it? Something in school, or was it after school? I mean, how did K-12 impact you, that you're here now?
Yeah. When I returned back to a traditional school, it was my 11th grade year. So I had been out of school for about 3 years, expelled in 8th, out of school for 3, bounced around into the alternative school system, GED programs, because, you're expected, I believe even then by law, to be enrolled somewhere. And so I was bouncing around when I finally enrolled into a traditional public school. I remember my first meeting when I was enrolling. I had a meeting with the assistant principal because I was flagged as gang affiliated, and so he wasn't going to let me in. And he was having a meeting with me to tell me that. And so he had decided to look at my transcripts. And so I'd been at an alternative school, and I had committed to, while I was there, I'm going to just show up every day. I know I'm not learning anything, but you know what? I want to have really good attendance. For me, it was just a thing. And so he had a hard time disputing that I didn't have some sort of commitment level. Mm-hmm. So he looked at the transfer like, okay, you actually go to school every day. There wasn't any disciplinary issues. And so he offered to give me a probationary status to start school there. And but I knew that I wasn't going to last long. Something was going to come up, and being involved in street gangs, you run into rivals immediately. And I think maybe my first couple of weeks, I had heard of a mecha group that was having a meeting, and all I associated with it was either Mexican Chicano kids who are meeting up after school, getting involved somehow. And my story had always been like, I followed a girl that I liked into this after school meeting, but I stayed because the person who showed up, she was a community leader, community organizer. What she was sharing, she was talking about the racial profiling by police. She was talking about the mistreatment of kids in our schools. And she was just on fire. And I'm, as a kid, this 16-year-old kid being from the streets, some level, I kind of like admired her power, because I thought, yeah, this person is just really down for what she's saying. But on this other consciousness level, what she was pointing at, I was thinking, yeah, that's what's happening. And I didn't have words for it as a kid. I just knew that, cops chased us. But when she spoke about the profiling of kids and really setting kids up for failure, like, yeah, that's what's going on. She gave me this consciousness that I was following a system that was designed in a certain way for me to end up in a certain place. A kid growing up in public housing, and literally across the street is the juvenile court, the juvenile detention center, and a group home that's literally across the street from where I live. Is designed this way. And in some ways, I felt like I was pretty angered. I was pretty fired up. Like, my life is set up to fail. And so she kind of served, what we call as this third space of learning. And her as a community leader, getting me involved, getting me politicized as a street kid made all the difference. And so that's what I always attribute. What turned me around was being adopted by community leaders, developing a consciousness, but also helping to empower for me to be able to do something about. So as a kid, being involved in everything from marches to press conferences to feeling like, I have power too. I just got to organize with people. I got to learn to be an organizer. Our district is talking about elevating student voice, but I think about how do we legitimately empower our kids so that they're able to make decisions about their own education. And that can be pretty threatening for an educational system. But I think it can be empowering, and we have to be pretty trusting of it, because I think kids do have a sense of what they need. The last couple of years, an emerging theme have been our kids asking for a decolonized education. And as an educator, I always find that that's interesting. I wonder what they mean by it. But if we say what we don't want, then let's talk about what is it that we do want. And I think for a lot of kids, like maybe we're talking about decolonizing to indigenizing, right? Decolonizing to something else. So we have to really think about what is it that they're looking for. And so, so that's kind of been my experience.
Yeah. So they're already finding that language. They're connected. and they know what they want and need. And it sounds like from your story, that's resistant capital that this educator harnessed within you, right? You had a critique, you had some, but it wasn't identified. When I go to the state juvenile Green Hills School, I've been there for 10 years. Like, they're raging against the machine, and I want to harness that because there's a critique. So let's bring analysis and consciousness, and contextualize and historicize. How are we here? I had 9 students a few weeks ago, and I just every once in a while I ask this. So how many of you are immigrants or children of immigrants? And 8 of the 9 are. And so that's that, here we are, everybody's incarcerated. They got years. I mean, some of them 22 years, 11 years, some serious crimes. But I point this out, like, I'm curious, how did we get here? What's the context that 8 of the 9 of you are immigrants or children of immigrants? So harnessing that that critique, that resistance, and putting it into a purposeful, as you mentioned here, right, from marches to press conferences, gives you that power. Yeah.
Yeah, and connecting what you're seeing to education. So when people talk about, this prison pipeline from schools to jails, it's a very real thing. And so when you think about kids who are incarcerated early on, what has been their experience in schools? Chances are probably a lot of discipline. That was my experience, even in detention and juvenile, was a series of discipline at the school level. And so I think it's, when we're talking about what are these important changes, is how we, it's reassessing discipline in schools. Because the moment that we start disciplining schools with detention, quiet rooms and so on, even as early as elementary school, those have lasting impacts on kids. It gives the message to them that they're just not good enough, and we don't know what to do with you, so we're going to put you somewhere else. All of my friends that I went to grade school with and school who were disciplined just as I was, spent a lot of time in prison. My reason why I wasn't in prison had less to do with my own personal abilities, but incredible fortune to have been adopted by community leaders, and really by chance, because you're going to, as much of a system is designed for kids to fail, there's always going to be a few that make it out, but I don't attribute it to any personal characteristics. But the discipline thing is something that I think a lot about. As a kid, the kid being sent to the office often because of acting out. When I look at that now, it's interesting because I'll get approached by other educators and say, hey, we got some kids in here in this classroom. They act out a lot. We don't know what to do. And I'll talk to that educator, that teacher, kind of what's going on. And I'll say, I'll speak from my experience. When I was that kind of kid, I was screaming out because this environment was asking me to conform to something I couldn't swallow. I didn't know how to express it or articulate it as a kid, but what it ended up looking like was me talking to my friends or me doing, things that were considered disruptive because I couldn't handle being in that environment because it wasn't seeing me. And I'll tell these teachers, I say, you know what, the kid who's acting out in that classroom might be the most rational kid in that room because their body is doing what it's supposed to do. It's rejecting what you're trying to force feed this kid. I said, that what that person is doing, it makes complete sense when you understand it from that lens. Those are the things that I think we just have to, just the discipline, what's going on with kids, and that we recognize the trend has been Black and brown boys. So to me, that's telling me, okay, there's something wrong with our schools. We need to assess our schools more than the assessment of our kids.
Wow, I'm so grateful you're here. You gave time. Is there any other message for the audience when we think about purpose of public ed that you kind of want to, put just a period on?
How do we get young talent, especially talent of kids of color, to think about being educators? Like, great, you have an incredible gift of mathematics or being an engineer or all of these other things that are in front of you. But, think about being an educator, because you would probably be amazing at doing that too. And so that would probably be my only message, is how do we get talented people to consider being educators? Because being a public educator, in the public, you feel like you're getting beat up all the time. And, we know that there's a lot of political motives behind that. But I think we have to really advocate, take a stand that public education is an incredible entity within our society, and it's a necessity, and we need to really double down on in public education. These are incredible professionals who've given their life's professional work to it. And I hope that its position in our society is it's elevated, because it should be valued just as much as kids want to aspire to be doctors and lawyers.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate your time, Randy. I'm really excited about this project and so glad you're part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime.
All right.